We apologise in advance for some sound quality issues on this recording. We were zooming between 3 different countries and the internet sometimes struggled to keep pace with our conversation. We hope it doesn't spoil your enjoyment of the episode. You are listening to the Visualising War podcast. In each episode, we talk about representations of war in art, text, film, and music. With new guests each time, we look at how people have described or imagined war in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which war stories have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I co-direct the Visualising War project at the University of St Andrews. Regular listeners might remember that our first guest interview on the podcast was with Lady Lucy French, the founder of Never Such Innocence, an organisation which gives children and young people a voice on conflict. We've been really inspired by their work, and as the series has developed, we've been nudged again and again to think more about the forces that shape children's habits of visualising war and peace, and also the power of children and young people's voices to influence how adults think about war, its aftermath, conflict resolution, and peace building. And I want to take this opportunity to thank listeners who've been in touch with us, as well as podcast guests. We're hugely grateful to you for the stories you've shared with us and the research questions which you've prompted us to look at more closely. So today's episode is the last in the current series, episode 50. It's been wonderful talking to so many different people and exploring so many different facets of the representation of war in different media over the last 12 months. We're going to be taking a break from podcast making over the next few months so that we can focus on a couple of very exciting new projects which are in development. One is a collaboration with artist Diana Forster, another of our early podcast guests, and a range of other artists, photographers, filmmakers, and academics to look at how we visualize the rupture of forced displacement, one of the many ripple effects of conflict. We'll share more about that project soon, and some new podcasts will come out of it, as well as some physical and virtual exhibitions, so do keep in touch for updates on that. The other project that we're working on is directly inspired by the conversations we've been having about the forces that influence children's habits of visualizing war and peace. We're going to be collaborating with a wide range of researchers in childhood studies, critical security studies, and peace studies to build an extensive network of academics and practitioners to ask some of the following questions. For example, what kinds of war stories are children of different ages most regularly exposed to in different parts of the world through films, gaming, school curricula, local folklore, graffiti, news reports, and so on? And what aspects of war dominate the narratives that children are exposed to? Also, what narratives about war's aftermath, conflict transformation, and peace building tend to circulate? And what do young children and young people think about the dominant modes of representing war and peace? How would they describe the impact which different narratives of war and peace have had on them? And how differently might they represent or narrate war, conflict transformation, and peace if they were in charge of the storytelling themselves? Finally, what impact can children's voices have on entrenched adult habits of visualizing war and peace? We're going to be working with lots of different storytellers in different fields, from the museum sector and the world of comics to journalism, gaming, and the publishing industry, among others. But above all, we're going to be involving children and young people in our discussions so that we learn directly from them. And that's why we've decided to use this final podcast to bring young people into the conversation, kicking off our new project just as we mean to go on. Our guests are former winners of the Never Such Innocence competition, Meleady-Hanley, Jasleen Singh, and Vasko Stamboliev. Molly was 15 when she entered a poem she'd written called My Brother Dan for the 2018 Never Such Innocence competition. And since winning first prize in her age category, she's gone on to be an ambassador for Never Such Innocence, writing more poetry and also branching out into playwriting, as well as representing Never Such Innocence on the world stage. Jasleen was 14 when she won first prize in the 2018 competition for a poem called The Indian Soldier. And like Molly, she's since become a Never Such Innocence ambassador, speaking at events at Buckingham Palace, the House of Lords, at the Centenary Remembrance Service at Westminster Abbey in 2018, and at a German Remembrance Service held at the Bundestag in 2020 to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Vasko, meanwhile, was 16 when his art won first prize in the 2018 Never Such Innocence competition. His piece was called Eyes Wide Shut but Mind Wide Open, and it was designed to reflect the fear and horror that soldiers feel in the midst of battle when they'd rather keep their eyes shut while having to keep them open, and the mental challenges that they then face in processing everything they've seen and been through. Like Molly and Jasleen, Vasko is now an ambassador for Never Such Innocence, And I'm really looking forward to talking to all three of them about their experiences of winning this prestigious competition and more broadly about the decisions they've made about how to narrate and visualize war for others. So, Molly, Jasleen, Vasco, many thanks for taking time to talk to me today and welcome to the Visualising War podcast.
Hi.
Hello.
So I've got lots to ask you about your involvement with Never Such Innocence and about the poetry and the speeches and artwork that you've produced reflecting on war and its impacts. But first, if I may, I'd like to take you back to your much younger selves to find out a bit about the war stories that you grew up with and how you think they might have influenced your habits of visualizing both war and peace. So, Jasleen, I wonder if we can perhaps start with you. What kinds of war stories did you tend to come across, or do you remember coming across as a young child, either through family stories or books or films? And how do you think they started to shape your habits of visualizing war?
As a young child, I think that the primary mediums that I sort of experienced war stories were through TV, books, and the school curriculum, inevitably, which was teaching us different periods in British history. I think what was very interesting to me was when I began to have conversations with other relatives. And when I grew slightly older and realized that the events of history that we are presented with is often written with the recipient in mind, meaning that the events are often tailored or presented in a certain way to give a more favorable slant towards certain parties. And I think that's incredibly interesting. It's something that I don't think as a young child you're much aware of, but certainly as you do grow older. And I think this is also a reflection of our current society as well, that we are living in a time where history is being challenged and different perspectives are now being knitted together to try and create a more three-dimensional and frankly a more truthful view on historical events and challenging previously accepted narratives when it comes to conflict.
That's a really interesting observation there. Yes, there are sort of these orthodox ways of narrating certain wars, which are often slanted, as you say, towards the interests of the sort of the target audience. But yes, you're right that we're in an era now where we're much readier to challenge that and listen to all sorts of different perspectives. So we've heard from Jasleen, but Molly, how do your experiences compare? What narratives or representations of war do you think were most influential in starting to shape how you viewed war from a young age?
Like Jasleen, I spoke to many family members, and I remember being told about my great-great-grandfathers and how they were in World War One and they fought on both sides in the conflict. I had uncles in the war as well, but I think because of my Irish side of my family, they were very influential during this time, and they were on all sides of the conflict, like I said, before the partition of the north of Ireland. So I think this meant that we had a lot of debates in my house and talks about all of this. And it just really led to such an interest in all these different events. And I'm a massive supporter of the theatre and the arts, and I've loved it ever since being a child.
One of the things that sparked your interest is a sense of hearing from multiple perspectives and trying to build a kind of balanced or complex picture of conflict by putting different voices together, through family stories, but other media as well, like theatre and the arts more generally. Yeah. And Vasco, that brings me to you. So Vasco, you were born in Belgrade. You moved to Greece when you were just 5. You then went to Perth in Australia and then back to Greece. So lots of different cultural and historical factors presumably have fed into your upbringing. As you grew up, did you notice similarities or differences in the ways in which war was presented to young children in those different places that you started your childhood in? And what kinds of war stories do you remember coming across as a young child?
Every country has its own differences. For example, in Serbia, I was born in Serbia, right? In Serbia, between all those 3 countries had the most recent war. So you could see from the faces of the people there that the faces were hard shaped. They were rough around the edges, mean all the time. In Australia, that there were not so much war. The war was overseas mostly. They were sending help overseas. They have a more patriotic spirit, right? They were more proud of their heritage and their root overseas. They had a more utopian style when they celebrated peace. They had the reality of the war was there, but it was kind of, how you call it? Every story had a happier ending than in Serbia, let's say, for example. In Greece, the difference between Serbia and Australia is the history and the rich heritage that the Greeks have from their ancestors, right? So they're very proud of their history and their roots. And I was going to school, I could see that they had that patriotic spirit in them, sometimes in a bad way, sometimes in a good way, right? But I remember going to school here in Greece, and every morning we would sing the national anthem. We would do our cross right after classes started. So that's the difference between those three countries for me. As for the war stories I've heard in Serbia, it's more recent, like I said. There's more hate. You don't hear much older stories. And so no one wants to really talk about it because it drowns you down. In Greece, when they talk about war, they talk about pride. We're strong. We were here and we're Greeks, right? And those are the kind of stories I always heard. And in Australia, they're always, like Jasleen said, Molly said, grandparents, they'll have a rich family history going overseas and helping different nations.
So some really, really interesting comparisons there between the different countries where you've lived, Vasko, with the historical proximity to or distance from war making a huge difference to the way in which people in different places experience it and want to narrate it and pass it on. You've sketched a very stark contrast between people not wanting to talk about it much and the ongoing sense of trauma in Serbia, preventing some storytelling as well as colouring storytelling, compared with that sense of Australia's wars being overseas and therefore more distant and leading perhaps to more of a rosy tinted way of looking at it. I think utopian was the word you used. And then that element also of connecting to a really deep past as well as the recent past in Greece with conflicts from 2,500 years or more ago, shaping their habits of visualizing and narrating more recent wars. Just sticking with you, Vasko, you've obviously been to school in several different countries. Jasleen has already mentioned school curricula, and I want to dig a bit into that now, if that's okay. So it would be really good to hear how you think the different school curricula that you've experienced teach both war and peace to children and young people.
Yes, Australia was always there on point. Every time there was a celebration about war, about peace, they would celebrate. Like I said before, they had that utopian style of teaching things, but also they put the harsh reality of war in front of you, but in a happier way. It wasn't that raw as in Serbia. You can see it even from the school spirit, the colors of the school. For example, in Serbia, schools are like prisons. They're built like prisons. They're gray. There's nothing happy about them. It's because of the style of teaching. We had a more strict style of teaching there in Serbia. You couldn't be happy when you were learning something. You couldn't enjoy it. Greece is somewhere in between. Like I said, they have a lot of pride, sometimes in a bad way, sometimes in a good way. That we always sing the anthem, we do the cross. They put a lot of emphasis at a young age in the history of the country we live in. But as we grow older, in the final high school years in Greece, the meaning of war and peace is lost because everyone starts thinking about where we're gonna study, where we're gonna go to uni. So the meaning of war and peace, it's lost. It's not taught. It's not even mentioned. But as in Australia, it goes through the last year. You learn about war. You always hear about war and peace and how important is peace and how we can improve our society. But in Greece and in Serbia, you don't hear that. You need to do it on your own.
Again, it's really interesting to hear those comparisons reflecting on the strengths as well as the weaknesses of the three educational systems that you've had experience of, with more or less optimistic or pessimistic approaches, and also differences in when war and peace fade out of the curriculum altogether. Jasleen, can we bring you in here? What impact do you think schooling has had on how you visualize war? I know that you were encouraged to apply for the Never Such Innocence competition by one of your history teachers, so it would be interesting to hear a bit about that. And perhaps also how you've been taught to look at war in different school subjects, not just in history.
So up until my GCSE years, we studied a very sort of rigid British curriculum. We looked at various different, so the Victorian era as an example, the First and Second World War as another. But one of the most fantastic things that our school offered were two different options at GCSE. One was more focused on British history, looking at the First and Second World War. and the other was much more international, and that was the one that I ultimately ended up choosing. This had 4 units. One was about apartheid, the other was the civil rights movement in the USA. Third was medical history and the setting up of the NHS. And then we had the period in Russian history where Lenin was rising to power. I think choosing a more internationally focused option did allow me to really begin to develop my skills as a historian, particularly in analysing sources and having a much greater appreciation as to how events are presented. I know I've touched on this previously. Where NSI comes into sort of my historical studies is very much that they inspired me, and the competition inspired me to go and look at more of my family history and a much more sort of personalised approach to history and looking at the past. And I think this is such a valuable thing for young people to do, to go and have those conversations with family members and to look into how history relates to them and their ancestors on a much more sort of personal level. I think by being able to go and talk to family members, you really learn a much more individualized history. And I think it begins to become much more relevant to you when you consider how your ancestors would have responded to situations of being in direct conflict, because it's not something that I've had any experience with. So trying to put yourselves in the shoes of someone else who's come before you, I think, is incredibly powerful.
So it's that combination of academic learning, studying history in an objective academic way, as you say, but also getting to talk to real people who've been through some of the events and experiences that you're studying at school that really brings it to life. I think you've talked to your grandparents particularly about their experiences of partition. Is that right?
Yes, it is. And also the military history in my family, which I know we'll go on to talk about later, which was what my poem was based upon. But these were things that I had no idea of prior to looking at inspiration for the Never Such Innocence competition. And I think that's one of the reasons why the work that the organisation does is so invaluable. Because as young people, it's very easy to sometimes feel slightly detached from these events, and you just view it as something, for example, you're studying in a textbook for an exam. But to be able to bring these things to life and to be able to view them through a creative medium allows young people to really challenge and contemplate different narratives. And I think the fact that Never Such Innocence is actively encouraging young people to do this is absolutely so crucial, I think, in developing an empathetic and really sort of open-minded generation of young people.
Mm-hmm. As you said earlier, it's about not looking at these events as inert pieces of history, which we can analyze objectively, but really getting in touch with them and feeling for them. Molly, can you come in on this? It would just be great to hear what your experience of learning about war and peace in school across different subjects has been. How much of your schooling has focused on war? Has much of your schooling also looked at conflict resolution and peace building, for example? And, do those different facets of war studies get as much time in the school curricula as each other, do you think?
Like Vasko, I have been to school in another country. I went to Ireland when I was younger and lived there for a bit. So I've been to 2 different countries and worked in both schools in Ireland and England. And the curricula is completely different. But I'd say in English schools, it's tended to be around winners and conquerors, and history focuses mostly on rulers. And I don't think we focus on the victories more than giving the ordinary people their voice and their stories come to life more. And I think that we look more at dates and the rulers instead of normal people. So I think when it came to my schooling, I would have liked to look more at ordinary people instead of the rulers and the higher power. But I really enjoyed my education at my schools, and I loved learning about the war, whatever I did. Like Jasleen, I learned quite a lot through history. I learned about the Cold War. I learned about Native Americans, which we wouldn't really have the chance if it wasn't for GCSE. So I was very grateful towards that. And then when I was in Ireland, I learned about the 1916 uprising and the oppression of the Irish people. And I think it was just very important as a young person to know all about those different things.
Obviously getting very different perspectives, as you say, from Irish and English schooling. And it's really interesting to hear you say about that focus on great events and dates and rulers more than on the everyday and the history of the ordinary person. My hunch is that that's changing a little bit, but I think it actually depends which wars you're looking at. As an ancient historian, I know that The questions on ancient warfare tend to be focused more around the effectiveness of the trireme as a warship, rather than on what people's experiences of conflict, ordinary people's experiences of conflict, really were. So that gives us a bit of a picture of your very different experiences of schooling across multiple countries and dipping into history, but presumably other subject areas too. I've got a question for all of you now, which is just building on that. So we've talked about school curricula, but there are obviously other forces that influence how children and young people visualize and imagine and understand war. Relative to school curricula, what other media do you think are really influential, from documentaries to comic books or gaming or museum spaces? What media do you think currently have the most influence on how young people tend to understand and view war today?
Yes, that's the medium I use. I think that's the first medium I got thrown war at me by images of Pablo Picasso. Mostly, if I recall correctly, those were the first images of war. Images. I heard the word war many times before because of my grandmother, and so on. But it was mostly paintings, art, and then songs. As you learn different languages, Greek language, their culture is really rich in music, and most old songs that write about war and the life that they live in poverty. Greek culture had a big influence also on me. Visualizing war. Australia kind of had that culture surrounding them about war. So at the moment you started school, the curriculum always would throw glimpses of war somewhere.
So a real mix there, Vasco, but I'm really interested to hear you say that painting and artwork has been one of the biggest influences while you were growing up on how you learnt to visualize war. But also, as you say, songs, the songs that are out there in the background that we might not listen to very attentively, but which are surrounding us and feeding us with very culturally specific ideas and concepts of war. Jasleen, coming to you, what would you say are the really dominant forces in the 21st century that you think particularly shape young people's habits of visualizing war?
We are all sort of very much the internet generation, and I think that has had the biggest difference in terms of how we are interpreting information more generally, and certainly when it does come to war. The internet is fantastic in the sense that you are able to compare and contrast perspectives, and you can look up effectively almost all mediums of expression, where ranging from paintings to documentaries to videos. And I think that this has really opened up a much wider conversation about information, about where we access our sources, and certainly how we evaluate them as well, because that is equally as important as finding and seeking out information. I think one of the other benefits is that we have the opportunity to engage in a depth of research that we want to. So it's very much sort of a personal choice as to how much you research into something and from what angle you do that. And I think that has huge sway in terms of our own personal opinions and how we build up a trove of information about conflict in particular.
Again, a really fascinating answer there. So yes, of course, we're surrounded by stories in all sorts of different forms that shape us and our habits of visualizing war. But as you say, we also have these very powerful tools at our disposal these days, which enable us just at the click of a button to do research for ourselves and look critically at the stories that are fed to us. You know, we can find out things which help us build our own pictures and deepen our own understanding, rather than simply absorbing the narratives that school textbooks or television documentaries or the people around us pass on. Molly, what about you? What do you think are the biggest influences right now on how children and young people visualize war?
Like Jasleen, I would say social media is a massive influence on many young people nowadays, but film and television are a massive contributors to it, because we've grown up watching these war films like Good Night, Mr. Tom. Narnia, I'd say, is not exactly a war film, but children can relate to it in the sense that if they lose their parents and things, and it's an amazing film to watch, and it gives so much representation to those different points. But myself personally, I do love to go to the theatre, and when I was in education with schools, they brought us to the theatre and we'd watch plays like War Horse and learn about these stories and animals in the war. stories we don't really hear about. We'd never really hear the perspective of animals. And I think it's amazing going to those sort of things. And then in class, learning about poetry, like Wilfred Owen, amazing poet. And his work is remembered nowadays and will go on.
So again, like Jasleen and Vasko, Molly, you're drawing attention to some very modern phenomena like social media, but also to poetry by Wilfred Owen, which has been shaping habits of visualizing war for over 100 years, as you say. And of course, for many school children in the UK, Wilfred Owen's poems are a really early influence, one of the first World War texts that they get to study, and so moving that they have a really profound impact. But you've also mentioned theatre there and books that get turned into plays and films. So really drawing attention to a wide variety of media that influence the ideas that children can go on to develop of what war involves. As Jasleen and Vasko have hinted, we obviously shouldn't see children just as passive recipients of adult narratives of war. All three of you as children were clearly keen to question, to do your own research, and also to tell your own stories of war in your own ways. And that brings me on to asking you a bit about what inspired you to enter the Never Such Innocence competition. So Never Such Innocence was founded in 2014, initially to give children and young people a chance to have their say on the World War I centenary commemorations. But it's since expanded its scope to look at conflict more broadly, not just the First World War. And it now runs an annual competition for 9 to 18-year-olds with entries on different themes like the impact of conflict on communities and life after conflict. And children have been entering poetry, art, speeches and songs. And I know that this year alone, they've had entries from over 40 different countries all around the world. So it really is a truly global phenomenon and its reach keeps expanding. Molly, I wonder if you can tell us how you first came across Never Such Innocence and why you decided to enter the competition.
The Lord Mayor of Sheffield and the council in Sheffield actually came across it first and entered my poem for me. So I wrote My Brother Dan when I was 11 years old, and I'd performed at different events for Remembrance Day since then with 212 Field Hospital in Sheffield. And what happened is they entered it for me, and then I won my age group, which was absolutely amazing. In the same year, Jasleen won her age group, and that's where we first met. The chances that Never Such Innocence have given me is just phenomenal and amazing. They're such an amazing organisation.
I wonder if you could read your winning poem for us, My Brother Dan. That's my attempt at a Sheffield dialect. And then perhaps once you've read it, you could tell us what you were trying to communicate with this powerful poem.
Yeah, of course. Yes, so this is My Brother Dan written in the Sheffield dialect, because I wanted to give light to the Sheffield dialect, which is not normally shown. My brother Dan went off to war, marching down Duke Street with his pals, heads held high while the Sheffield crowd clapped and cheered them so. Me mum wept, and me dad said, "Gi on, Molly, be proud, be happy for our lad. He's serving his king and country in a just war." 6 weeks later, we got a fancy cancan card from our Dan. Right chuffed we were. Dad read it out, puffed up chest, loud and clear. Dad said Dan was doing well and our Dan wished us all good cheer. Tucking card in pocket, he went off down road to get into a beer. 10 weeks later, on Sky Edge Fields, a neighbour came calling us from play, saying, "Come quick, Lizzie, your mum needs you right away." Opening our door on Talbot Row, we heard Banshee screaming. Our man, paper crumpled on the floor, sobbing and rocking hands to heaven. "Why did he have to die? Me son, me only son," she cried. Dan's body never came home. He lies without us in some distant land, in a place me man will never be able to go. And so she trudges every day to Norfolk Row, saying prayers and lighting holy candles for our Dan and other mothers' sons. These other boys whose lives too will never grow. And me, well, I keep asking me, son, why do they kill caterpillars and then complain that there are no butterflies? My dad said, "Listen up, our Lizzie. Them there caterpillars and butterflies have died to keep us all safe and free. You'll learn that one day, me love, when you're wise from being warm with care. Until then, me Liz, be proud and thankful for the sacrifice our Dan and his pals made for thee."
Thank you, Molly. That's a really powerful poem. Can you tell us a little bit about what influenced you in your writing of it and what you were trying to communicate with it?
Yeah, like I said before, I wrote it when I was 11. I was very interested in the Sheffield archives, and I remember going to the Sheffield archives and looking at all these different reports from soldiers and death reports and everything. And I just absolutely loved reading them. Even at the age of 11, I was so mesmerized by it. And I had the idea of writing the poem, Me Brother Dan, because I'd written a few poems before with Ian Clayton, the writer, who got me into writing fully, because I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him. And what happened was I wrote it, and because I wanted to write it in the child's perspective. It's about this young girl called Lizzie who watches her brother go off to war and sees her family's reactions around this, and he never comes back. And I think it's very powerful to hear that from a child, to hear her perspective finally, after how many stories we've heard of the soldiers' valuable perspectives. However, we never heard it from the family's point of view, and especially not a young girl. And I think that's why it was so important for me to write that, because this is the age she would have been anyway. It's around that sort of age. And it was an honour writing it.
It's really interesting, that idea that you're looking with fresh eyes because you're looking with these eyes of a girl who's observing her family's reactions, perhaps not fully persuaded by what her dad says, presumably horrified by her mother's grief, and asking huge questions through the metaphor of caterpillars and butterflies about what her brother's death actually means and why people are still sending young men like him to die. So it is really powerful, as you say, because of that perspective, because of that child's ability to kind of comment through observation on what's been going on. I think one of the amazing things about Never Such Innocence is that, as well as giving people a chance to share their views on conflict, it ensures that those views get really wide audiences. So Me Brother Dan is a great example of this. It was included in the official Battle of the Somme centenary commemorations. It was read out at the Menin Gate and carried by serving personnel from the UK and laid on the graves of every Commonwealth Armed Forces member who died in World War One as part of the official commemorations. Is that right?
Yeah, it was amazing how far it actually went and to honour these soldiers with my poem. I was so honoured, and that's why Me Brother Dan, I had to write it into a play then, because I had all these old men and women asking for me to write Me Brother Dan into a play because they thought Dan was a real person. I had to convince them he wasn't, because he was just someone who a little 11-year-old had made up in her head. But it was just amazing bringing the story to life.
But yeah, so someone, an 11-year-old made up, the fictional Dan has travelled actually to places that Dan's mam couldn't go. Because you say in the poem that he lies in some distant land, a place she'll never be able to go. And yet the poem travelled there and spoke to so many people on the way. So that's just one amazing example of one of the Never Such Innocence winning competition entries. But let's look at another one now. So Vasko, coming back to you, can you tell us first of all how you heard about Never Such Innocence and what prompted you to enter one of your paintings into the competition?
When I heard about the competition, it was a complete accident. I just walked in my English class. I was late. My teacher said, come here. And I thought I needed to go to the principal, right? Because I was late. And she says, I have a competition for you. It might interest you. Like, great. What competition is it? It's Never Such Innocence. Have you heard of it? No. Then do your research. I do my research. I'm like, the other day, okay, give me the papers to apply then. I look through the competition, I see what's all about it. I like the idea behind the competition, so that's why I applied. First, I did a painting of airplanes fighting, a surrealistic painting, and I look at it and I didn't like it. And I only had one day left to get in the competition. Because first I didn't want to do it, but then I said I need to do it. It's for a good cause. And I had one day left, and it's 12 o'clock at night, and I just throw the painting away because I'm not happy with it. I go to sleep, and then I wake up at 3 a.m. in the morning, and I do another one. I think you have seen the piece with the head cut off. It's like a prison, and the Zeppelins and airplanes are fighting in the head. with his eyes wide shut and his mind wide open, like the title. It's because so many monstrosities, and on this Mother Earth, we are the ones that make our own devils. We make a hell out of our living life for no reason. In the war that becomes greater and greater. Most soldiers were really young too, so they had that purity in them, and they were not touched by so much evil as older soldiers. So their eyes were shut, but their minds were wide open, so they wouldn't lose their minds. And I think that's how they survived because they found a greater purpose to serve. They found a purpose to live and fight for something that they thought was great. The strongest of them grabbed onto their humanity.
And you've described the picture a little bit already, but just for listeners, we'll pop the picture on the website with Vasko's permission so that people can look at it while they listen. It's the face of an unidentifiable man, as you say, Vasko, with his eyes wide shut, so not looking at us, but the mind is sort of blown open. And as you say, there are zeppelins and there are airplanes, and it looks like an explosion is coming out of his head. And it's an amazing visualization, as you say, of the trauma, the monstrosity, the monstrous things which young soldiers saw and had to process that metaphorically blew their minds. It's evoking that kind of process of transformation and what seeing war does inside one's head, inside a soldier's head, and the trauma of having to deal with that. Vasko, now you're an undergraduate art student at the Athens School of Fine Art. Is painting something that you've always found to be a really effective medium for communicating almost the unsayable? In that picture, you've packed an awful lot. How effective a form of art do you find painting for helping us to visualize war and what it does to us?
I think painting is the ideal form of expressing myself. I can express raw emotion with paints and brush strokes because video art or sculptures cannot exactly express raw emotion. You look at a painting and you start crying. With a painting, you capture the exact moment, the exact feeling in a solid box, and it cannot go away. It's there. You can touch it. You can feel its presence. For me personally, I think I can express myself with painting better.
That ability to capture, as you say, that raw emotion and then have that affective impact on people with it, with the snapshot that you capture on the page that tells such a big story all in one space.
I want every artwork to have a barbaric feeling in them, to not be all sunshine and happy smiles.
So we've talked about Vasko's art, Molly's poem. Jasleen, it would be brilliant now to hear about the poem which you entered the Never Such Innocence competition with, The Indian Soldier. I wonder if you can first read that for us and then tell us what you were trying to get across with it.
Absolutely. So, The Indian Soldier. This poem is to commemorate all of the 1.3 million Indian soldiers who came to an unknown country to fight for the British during World War I. Home is where the heart is. I heard a British soldier say that here. If that is true, my love, my home is a long, long way from here. My heart is under the mango tree, where its sweet blossoms smile almost as wide as me. Instead, shells are pouring like rains in the monsoon. Only we don't know for certain that these will ever stop. My heart is wandering somewhere far away from this God-forsaken land, where night is never silent and stars are never seen. Our richly spiced food is traded for a cold, hard bread. It impales my teeth like the bullets struck in the walls back home. My heart longs to fly away from here and join the flock of migrating birds. They are escaping the smoke that plumes like wispy ghosts, for a brighter land with silks of red, yellow, and orange, and a sun that beams just as vividly. My heart longs for freedom and peace. I have a wish that my children can live in a world with more justice than me. I do this for a promise, my love, a promise to own the soil beneath our feet. My heart belongs to the cornfields and a warm breeze running free. Instead, the corpses cover the fields like sheaves of harvested corn. My heart belongs to the children. Hold them tight, my dear. Tell them whatever happens, Papa will always be near. Tell them funny stories. Make them laugh from ear to ear. I shall be able to hear their laughter, even from a place as far as here. Our hearts long to sing. Instead, they are silenced, hidden amongst the millions of white crosses surrounding our graves. Why? We too gave our all when it came to the cry of the fight. Now, this poem, as I mentioned at the beginning, was written to commemorate the Indian soldiers who came to fight for the British. And I think what I was trying to highlight, and I certainly used my own ancestors who fought in various conflicts, was about the impact of war on foreign soldiers. Now, there were a sizable amount of minorities who came and formed part of the British Army in particular. And I think that it's so important that we try and imagine sort of what they would have gone through in a very unique and unfortunate circumstance as there was then. And I think that what the poem is trying to highlight in particular is the fact that they all longed for the comforts of home. And India is a very different place to the UK, not least sort of in terms of its climate, in terms of the atmosphere and the culture. And I think it's really just trying to highlight the fact that these soldiers would have really missed their homes and their families. And ultimately, they were just longing for that. And they came to fight in an unknown country, in an unknown place. And there was no reassurance that they would ever be able to see their families again. So it was a really horrific situation for them. And I think that it's so important that when we do honour the sacrifices of soldiers, that we keep in mind those who came from abroad. I just think it just aims to also convey the fact that the Indian soldiers, at least, were fighting on the promise that there would be an independent India. And ultimately that didn't materialise. So I think that it's very much, as we've discussed previously, trying to look at history with a very holistic perspective and really try and understand and dig deep into the motivations of the soldiers and the mindset that they would have had entering into these really horrific situations.
Absolutely. I mean, I really do think that that poem is a fantastic example of a piece of work that stretches the way we visualize the war, that war in particular. As you say, holistic is a really good word, making sure that the range of different people's experiences are part of the wider story, the holistic picture that we paint of this conflict. And I think for me, one of the things which that poem does is really get us to think about all the cliches that we have of sacrifice and fighting for home by redefining home and by showing us that home might mean many different things to many different people. And then the poignancy of the fact that, as in Molly's poem, Me Brother Dan, death gets in the way of any kind of homecoming, and the sort of final resting place and the grave is physically far from home, but in all ways, in terms of its colour, its warmth, its weather, it's so very far from home as well. Staying with you, Jasleen, all of you, as a result of winning, have become ambassadors for Never Such Innocence. And that's given you the opportunity to attend all sorts of events and speak in other fora, present your poems, but also do other things too. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and about what your involvement with Never Such Innocence has done for how you have gone on to think about and narrate war and indeed peace, and how the contact that you've had with other people and their different viewpoints has perhaps shaped how you want to speak about war and peace now.
I've been very privileged with my experiences following on from entering the competition. I became an ambassador for Never Such Innocence after attending the awards ceremony at the Wellington Barracks in the Guards Chapel, which is also where I met Molly, first of all. And I was able to recite my poem there. And that was sort of the first exposure that I had of reciting it out loud to an audience of distinguished delegates. And it was incredibly exciting for me in the sense that I'd won this competition, but also I was in a room with some incredibly talented individuals who had all taken the time and had been inspired by the brief given by Never Such Innocence to reflect on conflict and on war. And to hear poems like Me Brother Dan, for example, it was brilliant. And it really just opened up your mind to how young people across the UK and indeed internationally, as Never Such Innocence has always run an international competition, were viewing conflict. I've been very privileged to have become an ambassador for Never Such Innocence, and I've since recited my poem at Buckingham Palace, the House of Lords as well. And I've also been chosen to speak as one of 3 young people at the Westminster Abbey Remembrance Service in 2018. And that was in the presence of Her Majesty the Queen, the royal family, prime ministers past and present, and also the federal president of Germany. So I've had the most incredible exposure possible to some very esteemed individuals. And I was chosen to read a prayer there, which was a huge honor. And to experience such a poignant event from the perspective of someone who was fortunate enough to participate was incredibly humbling. And it was certainly an unforgettable experience. I also last year in 2020 was able to travel to Germany to take part in the German Remembrance Service, which was commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Second World War. It was particularly significant because it was the first time that a member of the British royal family had attended a remembrance service in Germany. And HRH Prince Charles was there, as was the Duchess of Cornwall. And I was actually personally asked to meet them after the ceremony alongside the federal president of Germany, the president of the Bundestag, and the president of the Volksbund. My role as part of the ceremony was to be part of a team of 4 young people. We had one girl there who was from Germany, one boy who was from Israel, and another girl from Moldova. And we were all tasked with writing a 3-minute speech to deliver to the assembly. And the brief that we were given was to reflect on the anniversary and particularly look at it from the perspective of being a young person and what our hopes and dreams were for the future, and reflecting on events past and present and how we can marry together the lessons that have hopefully been learned from these conflicts to really strive towards solving some more global issues that we're facing today, such as climate change, for example. Once again, something to highlight is that being part of this event allowed me to meet with young people from across the globe. And it was also fantastic to have that exposure to such high profile figures. And I think what it has done is it's really opened my mind. And I think the fact that Never Such Innocence runs an international competition is so notable, because what it does is it's bringing together and it's uniting young people who have a common passion for being creative, and they're able to come together and to express their own views on conflict through a creative medium. And it's really powerful for us to be able to discuss with each other, not just our creative work, but also what goes on in our wider lives, because I think that's so enriching for all the parties involved.
So lots of dialogue being facilitated there by Never Such Innocence between and across an international generation of young people whose views are then also being heard by some of the most powerful people in the lands. Can you just give us a glimpse of what you talked about in your 3-minute speech?
Yes, so I began with very much recognizing the victims of conflict, not just in terms of the soldiers and those who made the ultimate sacrifice, but also the many civilians who were badly affected when ultimately they weren't fighting, they didn't have any particular stake in it, but they were the ones who lost family members, who were displaced. And tragically, the effects of that was felt throughout many generations. And it was really about thinking that when a soldier died, and this was one of the specific points that I mentioned, that soldier would have been a sibling, someone's son, someone's father. So when one soldier dies, it's not just that one soldier dies, it's that an entire family has been affected by that. And if you take that view, then you can begin, well, perhaps not even truly begin to contemplate how horrifically widespread this suffering was. I think ultimately I also wanted to end it on a positive note and really talk about empowering people of all ages to use our voices and to really engage with activism and current affairs such as climate change, as ultimately conflict can take many different forms, and we are certainly facing some rather large ones. So I think really learning those lessons from history and trying to constructively engage in dialogue and not engage directly in conflict is so important. So encouraging diplomacy and conversations between young people from different countries is absolutely essential in terms of building a better society going forward, and one that is much more constructive and avoids, crucially, the mistakes that have been made in the past, which have led to such horrific suffering.
Absolutely. And I think we might come back to those points, but you're painting a really important picture there of dialogue between young people leading to diplomacy and activism and collective action around many, many big issues, which of course intersect all the time with conflict. So an awful lot of the conflict that we might see going forward is probably going to be climate related in some form or another. And so having a voice and feeling empowered to speak and converse and discuss on such important big issues is very, very important. Molly, you've talked about the fact that you've been writing from a very young age and you're a published playwright and you've had your plays performed at the Sheffield Crucible and so on. And I think you were also commissioned on the back of your Never Such Innocence work to write something for the opening of the Invictus Games. Is that right? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So I wrote a poem back in 2019 now, so all before COVID hit. And I was asked by Never Such Innocence, which was an amazing opportunity to write a poem for the opening of the Invictus Games. And I wrote about a child speaking to a father who had lost limbs. And I read it out at the opening of the Invictus Games in Sheffield because it was held here that summer. And I was performing alongside people like Alfie Boe, who was one of my idols. And I was just so, so grateful to be given the opportunity to do this and especially tell this sort of story to a room full of men and women who had fought for our country and had lost limbs, a few of them. And it was really honourable to do it.
As with my brother Dan, you seem to be really interested in re-visualising these experiences of conflict from a child's perspective. So I think naturally when we think about the Invictus Games, our attention focuses on the adults who have lost the limbs, but your poem focused on how a child responds to that when their father comes home from a war so badly injured. And I think in general, you're very interested in representing marginalised viewpoints. I know that you've written other work reflecting on Muslim contributions to and losses during the world wars. You've written a poem also using the Greek heroine Penelope to think about women's oppression. So do you think that interest in marginalised perspectives and amplifying marginalised voices drives a lot of your work?
So since being very young, I've been involved with my mum, who's been involved in like humanitarian works. So she's been all over the world in different conflicts. So when I was younger, I went with her to those different places and I got to view these camps that people were in and hear from voices that are not really listened to. So women, disabled people, children, for example, and refugees. So I focus on refugees a lot because I think their voice needs to be heard as well. Because I'm involved with the kinder transport. And when I spoke to those now older citizens, they were young children when they had to leave those countries to do with World War II. And their stories were never heard until now. And they've got generations after them of grandchildren and children. And if they weren't saved and if their voices weren't heard, they wouldn't be here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Vasko, as a result of COVID, you haven't had as much opportunity to attend events as an ambassador for Never Such Innocence as Molly and Jasleen have had. But can you tell us a little bit about how your involvement with Never Such Innocence has perhaps shaped what you want to do in terms of advocacy going forward? And maybe you could also reflect a little bit on the power that you think young people's voices have to shape how we think about war and peace, how we think about conflict in the future.
This year I was a judge for the art competition of Never Such Innocence. I was really stunned. It really opened my mind when I saw especially the younger categories, like 12 years old, 13, 14, 15. I couldn't believe that 14 or 15-year-old would do that and had that idea in their head and express it on paper. And I was really impressed and I was really happy about that actually. And it was an eye-opening experience. It opened my mind. It made me think differently because there were many cultures involved, from Asia to Latin America. I wasn't aware of some problems our world has, especially in the far corners of the earth. So I was really happy with the experience, and I was really happy that I could contribute to that. And it sounds bad, but if I could give awards, I would give awards to everyone because everyone's special.
What you've just said there resonates with a phrase that Jasleen was using earlier, this mind-opening aspect of listening to, and in your case with the art, looking at the views which all sorts of really young people, as well as slightly older young people, have been putting on paper. This creative capacity of young people, which I think we endlessly underestimate, the well-informed nature of those views and are then communicated in such creative ways. And again, like Jasleen, you touched on this sort of the international, the multicultural dimension of all these competition entries and this artwork that you were looking at, raising your awareness of problems around the world. So it comes back to this idea that the Never Such Innocence competition just gives young people this platform to share, and that sharing then informs us all. Jasleen, just coming back to you, what I want to do now is just move on. We've talked a lot about Visualising War and the forces that shape our habits of visualising war and representations of war, which all of you have been involved in. But it'd be really good to move on a little bit, think about that whole spectrum of representing and visualising everything from war to aftermath to conflict resolution and peace building. And just to get your view a little bit on what role children and young people can play in that. I think you've been involved in a Model United Nations, for example, through school. And so you've been looking at the challenges that people are facing in Afghanistan, among other things. What value do you see in involving young people in discussion of these huge problems and in solutions finding for these huge national, local, but also global challenges?
Ultimately, if you want to create change, then I think that truly does begin with young people. And I think that what Never Such Innocence has acted as, and certainly over the last few years, is they've been an international catalyst, really, for provoking a spark of creativity within young people. And it's not something that I entirely appreciated when I entered, but it was only later on when I was in a room with so many other talented and passionate young people that I realized that there is so much power within young people, not just creative power, but also in so many different other types of expression, really. And I think that by bringing young people together and encouraging them to reflect on conflict, we begin to almost question certain narratives that have been presented in the past. And I think that by changing this mindset and encouraging a more diplomatic and sort of problem-solving based approach and not necessarily resulting to violence quite so quickly in terms of resolving conflict, what we're doing is teaching a generation of young people who will ultimately go on to become the future leaders and the future decision makers of the world to pursue different solutions to problems and to think differently than what's been done before. And once again, I think that Never Such Innocence is absolutely invaluable in really starting that conversation. And all of us here have been beneficiaries of the kinds of amazing projects that they've done. And I'd thoroughly encourage anyone who wants to know more about their work to visit the website and look at some of the winners' entries. But when you do, you'll be truly astounded at the power of creativity that some children as young as 10, 11 years old have. It's one of the only organizations that I think recognizes this potential and is doing all that it can to really harness that and to create this generational change that I think we are already seeing to a certain extent in wider society.
You know, we've got all sorts of young people who've become really powerful and really high profile ambassadors and campaigners and activists, you know, Malala, Greta Thunberg. But you're absolutely right that Never Such Innocence is catalyzing more and offering this sort of platform. And on our website, we will have a short blog which has the poems of Molly and Jasleen and the artwork of Vasko, but also links to the Never Such Innocence website where you can look at the winners' booklets from every year of the competition. And they really are well worth diving into and spending a lot of time with, because as you say, they do really blow your mind with the ideas and the questions. That's one of the words that I pick out really of your answer just then, Jasleen. Yes, conversation, dialogue, solutions finding, but also questioning these entrenched habits of going about thinking of war, thinking of peace, thinking of conflict resolution, really questioning that and thinking critically. And all of that then feeds into empowering a new generation of problem solvers. Molly, this year's Never Such Innocence competition is focused on life after conflict. Do you think that we spend as much time as we should visualizing aftermath and conflict resolution and peace building as we do visualizing combat and conflict itself? And again, maybe you could think a bit about what young people have to add to that.
Yeah, I really don't think that attention is given enough to the aftermath of war and conflict, or conflict resolution, or conflict transformation. I do think that children are excluded from this and adults are given the forefront and being able to express their views, but children not really as much. I think they're powerless, but they have a voice that should be heard. And like Jasleen said, children and young people are the people who are going to be the world leaders in the future, who are going to be making the decisions. And we are going to be the ones left with looking after the world with what's happening right now with climate change. It's the young people who are going to be affected. So we're the ones trying to make the difference. And that's why I think young people should be heard, because it's the world that's going to be left behind to us, and we want to make it a better place.
And Vasco, can I come to you? So we've been talking a bit about the power of young people's voices, the questions that they can raise, the sparks that they can use to sort of to catalyze problem solving going forward. What are you planning to do with your painting going forward? Do you think you will paint more about conflict? Do you think your painting is going to focus on other issues? Do you see yourself doing more advocacy with your painting? What are your plans for the future?
My plans for the future. Mostly now I'm concerned with, let's say, social problems. I'm making a really big painting now. It's called Give It Up, a now title, Modern Hell. It's going to consist of 5 to 6 paintings. And I just want to show the world what modern hell means, what our society is going through. In quarantine, I created 20 pieces of painting with ink and watercolor, showing in a funny way, but also in a serious way, everyday scenes from people and how our lifestyle is changing with a mask on. So I hope this year I can exhibit these 20 pieces here in Greece. But for now, I have in mind the Modern Hell project that I'm working on. And we'll see how it goes. I hope you're going to see it in some big museum or gallery. Who knows?
So you've been using your painting to put some of the stark social challenges we face under the spotlight, to look critically at them and really reflect on them. Molly, turning to you, what are your plans going forward, and what are you hoping to do next with your poetry and theatre writing and other advocacy activities?
Never Such Innocence has inspired me to help other children younger than me and give them a voice and let them be creative. And I will go on helping Never Such Innocence and being with them, because they're such an amazing organisation who give voices to all sorts of young children from all different walks of life. And Lady Lucy French and her team are truly magnificent, giving this chance to people, and how amazing all these children are. But for me, I study at Oxford School of Drama at the moment for acting, and I want to do acting in the future, but also become a playwright and carry on with my poems and give people a voice through acting and through playwriting. I'm currently writing a play against sexual assault and a woman's point on that. So I think that's very important. Just want to keep raising awareness for all different minorities and giving everyone who doesn't have a voice a voice.
So, like Vasco, in a very different way, using your creative talents to shine a spotlight, to put some of the challenges of society under the microscope, get us to look at them, but from the perspective of people we might not hear of before. And you use that phrase, giving people a voice. That seems to be a very, very common thread of all of your work. Jasleen, just finally with you, what are your future plans?
I definitely echo what Molly said about continuing to support Never Such Innocence in any way that I can, because the experiences I've had as a result of entering the competition have been truly life-changing. And I would agree that Lady Lucy has done so much good in the world, even in the short time that Never Such Innocence has existed as an organisation. And the fact that such a platform exists and is really investing in young people and allowing them to be creative is so powerful. And I think that certainly just by creating this competition, they will have changed so many lives, even if it's just by getting someone to pick up a paintbrush, pick up a pen and reflect on conflict and to create something. On a personal level, I have always enjoyed reading and writing, is very much my first love. So I think I'll definitely continue to do that. And certainly taking into consideration all the people that I've met, both young and old, across the events that I've been to, I think it's certainly reframed the way that I see a lot of the events around the world, and being able to translate that via a creative media is such a joy for me to do. And hopefully it will also have impact on people who read the work. That's sort of what my plan is, really. And certainly I think I will continue to do it, and hopefully sort of as I go forward and have more experiences in the wider world and get to know more people, then my mindset will only be broadened by that. And that can only ever be a good thing, I think.
Mm-hmm. So it's clear from talking to you just for this short time that all of you have been so inspired and shaped by your involvement with Never Such Innocence, that it's been eye-opening. I think that's a phrase that a couple of you have used more than once in the conversation. It's opened your minds. And Jasleen, the phrase you just used then, and I think Molly too, changing people's lives, changing individual lives by empowering people, but also on a more macro level, by empowering whole generations of young people to have a say and have a voice, actually potentially changing things in a really profound and international way. So it's really fantastic to hear that. I mentioned the project which the Visualising War project is developing for the future, looking at the forces that shape children's habits on visualising war and peace. And we're delighted that we're going to be partnering with Never Such Innocence on some of that work. So very much looking forward to taking that forward. But for now, Molly, Jasleen, Vasko, thank you so much for talking to me today. It has been wonderful learning about the forces that shaped your habits, your early habits of visualizing war and peace, and then also how each of you in different ways took up your pens and your paintbrushes and started narrating war for yourselves in really powerful and influential ways. And I'm really grateful to you for sharing your experiences and helping us to end this podcast series in such an inspiring way. I want also to thank you, our listeners. I hope you've enjoyed this final episode, or final at least for now. And I hope that it's given you a good flavour of some of the work that we want to pursue going forward as we develop our research into children and young people's habits of visualising war and peace, and also, above all, the impact which their voices can have on how we all imagine and talk about and plan and pursue war and peace in future. A particularly huge thank you to our regular listeners. I do hope that our conversations with artists, photographers, novelists, composers, museum curators, journalists, illustrators, documentary makers, and so on, and a whole host of academics as well, have raised some really interesting questions in your minds about the war stories that we tell and the impact that they can have on us. We'd really love to hear what you think about the series as a whole. So please do get in touch with us via social media or by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. And do dive back into our archive if there are any episodes you've missed. And also don't forget to share the podcast with others you know who might be interested in thinking about how we visualize both war and peace. So this isn't goodbye forever, it's just au revoir for now. Please keep in touch to hear updates on our current and future projects, and we hope to welcome you back to the podcast before too long. As usual, a shout out to Jonathan Young, who composed our opening and closing music, and the biggest shout out of all to our wonderful sound editor, Zofia Gertin, who has spent hours and hours editing each episode over the past 12 months. The series simply wouldn't exist without her, and we're hugely grateful to her for her fantastic work. As a team, we're really proud of the work that we've done in generating new conversations about our habits of narrating and visualizing war, and we're looking forward to lots more conversation going forward. So watch this space, and thank you very much for being part of the journey so far.